Hello and welcome to Theatre of Music's live lesson. And today's lesson is going to be all about Tudor music. And specifically, we're looking at musical monarchs and Tudor musical instruments. And the whole of the next 6 weeks is going to be devoted completely to Tudor music because it's a fascinating period of music. So, without further ado, let's have a little think about what is Tudor music. What is Tudor music? So we're going to put it into historical context because I think that's really important to understand how it all fits into the history of things. I think we know a little bit about when the Tudors were. So we're looking at a period of history between 1485 and 1603. And 1485 is a really important date in history because that's when the Tudors came to power. We had the Battle of Bosworth. Richard III was defeated. Henry VII became the king. And that's when the Tudor dynasty started. And it carries on right through Henry VIII and Edward VI, I think it is, and Mary, and right through to Elizabeth I. Now, the Tudor period, and I know it sounds like I'm giving a bit of a history lesson, but it's really important to understand the context. The Tudor period is an English period of history. We refer to the Tudors because the Tudors were on the throne during this particular period of history in the 15th and 16th century. But it coincides with what's called the Renaissance period of history in Europe. And when we split music up into periods, actually, normally we would refer to the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Classical, and the Romantic. And so this idea of Tudor music fits perfectly into that Renaissance period of history and Renaissance period of musical history. It's important to remember that the Elizabethan era, Elizabeth I, is also part of this Tudor time, because we think of the Elizabethan era almost as a separate thing, but she was a Tudor monarch, so it covers right through until the end of her reign in 1603. So there's your history lesson. That sort of puts it all into context, when it is, what it's about. So let's have a little think about our musical monarchs. For a start off, Henry VIII, you can see a little picture of him there in the top left corner. So Henry VIII is an interesting character for lots and lots of reasons, but he was a really good musician. He'd got a large collection of musical instruments, and his instruments included, when he died, because they did an inventory, 5 sets of bagpipes. Now we think of bagpipes as instruments connected sort of with Scotland and very traditional sound for Scottish music. I love bagpipes. I absolutely adore bagpipes. 78 recorders. Now that sounds slightly excessive, even to me, but we've got to remember as well that at this time, recorders, we're not just thinking of the little Descant recorder that you've perhaps seen. You might have one at home. We're talking about different sizes of recorders. So you can get small ones, you can get huge ones. So 78 in that respect maybe isn't quite as many. It still feels a lot to me. A virginal, and we're going to find out what a virginal is in a moment, and lutes. And actually you can see a picture of a virginal and a lute in the bottom right hand corner. But as I say, we're going to find out a little bit more about these musical instruments. But that's only some of the instruments that were in his collection. There were lots of instruments in his collection, and it puts into perspective just how important music was to Henry VIII. He played lots of these instruments. He was an exceptional recorder player, absolutely brilliant recorder player. It's been recorded in history. But he didn't just play the recorder. He composed music as well. He composed ballads, which are types of songs. He wrote church music. And although a lot of these pieces have been lost, there is evidence of him composing and producing pieces of music and them being performed. And there is a piece of music called Pastime with Good Company, which is attributed to Henry VIII. Very important. He didn't compose Greensleeves. that's like an urban myth. Lots of people for a long time, it's not their fault, lots of people for a long time thought that Greensleeves was a Henry VIII composition, myself included. But they've been doing lots and lots of research, and they think now that actually it's a piece of music that came over from Europe and was sort of adopted. And there's evidence that it wasn't actually around until quite late on in the sort of Tudor history. So past the point of where Henry VIII was actually alive. So for the moment, Henry VIII did not compose Greensleeves. But Greensleeves is a Tudor piece of music, and we'll come back to Greensleeves in a few weeks' time. We've also got Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I loved music. She played the virginal, the keyboard instrument, and the lute, and something called the guitarn, which is an early type of guitar. Absolutely loved music, and there's references in history to her playing the virginal and people listening and commenting on it. I remember one quote actually wasn't that complimentary. It was something like she was an inadequate virginal player, which doesn't sort of, it's a little bit harsh maybe, but she loved to dance though, and she considered dancing a really good form of exercise. And so she employed lots of musicians to play for her so that she could do lots of dancing. And again, we're going to be looking at dances, music for dance, Tudor music for dance specifically, in a few weeks' time, and looking at different types of dance, because just like now, where you've got all sorts of different types of dance, if you're into your Strictly, then you've got your waltz and you've got your samba and salsa and all those sorts of things. They've got different types of dances then too, pavans, and you'd got I don't know, the waltz hadn't been invented. You've got a piece of music called the La Volta, which was one of Elizabeth I's favourite. But we'll cover that in more detail in a few weeks' time. The focus today really is on the musical instruments, so that you get a feeling of what the music sounded like during that period of history. So let's have a look at some of these musical instruments. The first one we're going to look at and eventually maybe listen to, there's a little hint there, is the virginal. Now you can see in the picture that the virginal is a keyboard instrument, and it's a really pretty little keyboard instrument. They would be, some of them would be very highly decorated, as you can see in the one we've got in our picture. You would have quite a small keyboard, and it would be on the left-hand side of the instrument in Britain, in England specifically, but elsewhere on the continent, they might move the keyboard to the other side. And you could also have some of these virginals where you've got two keyboards. They're called double virginals. Now, these keyboard instruments are probably some of the oldest that are part of what we call the harpsichord family. The harpsichord family is basically, it's to do with the mechanism, how they work. So if we talk about a piano has got strings in it, just like a virginal or a harpsichord, but there's little hammers inside that hit the string. And depending on how hard you hit the key, depends on how hard the hammer hits the string. So you can play louds and quiets, and it has a particular type of sound. The mechanism inside a virginal or inside a harpsichord is the strings were plucked with something called a jack, which is like a plectrum, and it would just pluck the string. Now you can't pluck it harder or more gently depending on how you hit the key. It just plucks it. So you couldn't have the same amount of dynamic variation that you can have on a modern piano. It also gives it a very distinctive sound, because obviously you're plucking the strings almost like you would pluck a guitar. In Britain, they're often rectangular in shape, but elsewhere they can be in different shapes. But the virginal is usually rectangular. And it's first mentioned in England in 1530, because that's when Henry VIII actually bought 5 of them. 5 virginals. I mean, he's not going to play them all at the same time, surely, but he bought 5 virginals. Small virginals were played actually in your lap. which seems, you know, when you look at the picture, that seems a little bit difficult. But they could be put on a table, demonstrated there, or later ones actually had their own stands to stand the instrument on. And the word virginal can be used for any stringed keyboard instrument at this time. That it's not sort of specific. Hardly any keyboard pieces that were written back then can be said to be specifically written for the virginal. Because basically pieces could be played on a virginal, or they could be played on a harpsichord, or they could be played on a clavichord. It's the same principle, same type of setup of instrument. And so you would have something like, there is, for example, a collection of pieces called the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, which has got lots and lots of keyboard pieces in it, over 300. And the music sort of dates from about 1562 to about 1612. And all of these pieces have been put together in this collection. And it says on it, Fitzwilliam Virginal Book. It's sort of given that name because Fitzwilliam put, you know, it's his book and it's got virginal music in it. But it could be played on a harpsichord. It could be played on a clavichord. So when we're talking about a virginal, we're talking about an instrument that is part of this harpsichord family, but the music that was written was not specific to just the virginal. So that's our first instrument that we're looking at, keyboard instrument. Perhaps should have pressed that button first. The next one we're going to look at, and this is going to be very interesting because I'm going to try and demonstrate something for you, and it's quite difficult. The shawm. The shawm is very similar to what we would call a modern oboe. And an oboe is what we call, it's a woodwind instrument, and it's what we call a double reed instrument. Okay. Now, for me to try and do this, and say this is going to be a big test, I am going to show you what a double reed actually looks like. So let's see if I can show you how this works. So this is a double reed. It's two pieces of wood. Let's see if we can do that. That are put together. There we go. And you can see that there's like a tiny little hole between, which is where you blow down. If you're playing something like a clarinet is a single reed instrument. It's got one piece of wood and you put it against the mouthpiece. But oboes are these double reed instruments. It's a tiny little reed and you have to really blow. It's very hard, as I'm going to prove in a moment. It's really hard to play this. Now, the shawm had like a little thing that went over the top of it. An oboe doesn't. But the shawm would have like a little piece of wood that would go over the top of it to protect the reed from the lips. Now, if you're an oboe player, and I'm not, if you are an oboe player, very often you leave your reed sitting in water because it needs to be quite moist for it to be actually played. So I'm going to have a go at making a sound so you can hear what the reed sounds like. Takes a lot of effort. That's why I didn't choose the oboe. So you sort of blow down it, you put your lips around it, and you are just moisten it a bit more. Okay, so that's what a double reed looks like. So you can actually see what it looks like. And then obviously it's connected to an instrument. I've only got the reed. It's connected to an instrument, and then by blowing through, it makes the sound. It's really. I've take my hat off to oboe players because I wouldn't want to. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Right. Let's see if I can just. Okay. We'll go for that. So let's get rid of me. So that's the shawm, and you can see that it looks similar to a modern oboe. Double reed instrument, and it had that wooden disc that covered the reed, and it supported the lips. It's designed to be played, the shawm, not the oboe. The shawm's designed to be played outside. It's quite a loud instrument. And it comes originally, I'm just going to put the reed away to protect it because they are quite delicate. Comes from the Middle East originally, Middle Eastern origin. And it was introduced to Europe during the Crusades. It's used in dance and ceremonial music. So, Elizabeth I would have been quite familiar with shawms. And it comes in different sizes. So the oboe, you get one size. But with the shawm, you would have different sizes. You could have a treble one, which would be a smaller one. And then you would have, it would go all the way up to great bass, which would be a really quite big one. It sort of declined in use in the 17th century, so the 1600s. It sort of went out of fashion. And it's like with a lot of these musical instruments that were around in the Tudor times, in the Renaissance period, they sort of went out of fashion as technology developed and musical instruments developed. But you can see the historical origin of the modern instrument, like the oboe. You can sort of make that connection with the shawm. Okay. So we have covered the shawm, but another instrument that was around at the same time, which also is a double reed instrument, is something called the crumhorn. I love that name, the crumhorn. Now, the crumhorn means bent or curved horn, and I think we can see why the crumhorn was given that name. Okay. It's also a double reed instrument. But this time the reed is completely enclosed by a wooden cap. So your lips aren't touching it at all. And it's played like a recorder. But the cap means that you can't control the louds and the quiets. There's no dynamics because the lips aren't touching the reed. Henry VIII made it quite fashionable in English court. He was quite a fan of the crumhorn. And it's referred to as a 9-note instrument because the range is really limited because of the number of holes you've got. There's no, on modern instruments, you very often will have a key at the back somewhere, like on a clarinet, a register key, which makes it so you can extend the range. You can't do that on a crumhorn. There's no extra keys or mechanism to make it extend its range. It sounds very buzzy. And really, what I should have done was brought a kazoo, because I think it's quite kazoo sounding. If you think of a kazoo, that sort of buzzy bzz sound, that's what you get when you listen to a crumhorn. Okay, quite a big fan of the crumhorn. And all of these instruments, actually, if you have a little look on YouTube, there you can find people playing them, because there are people that still play these instruments even today. They are using them for reenactments and for authentic performances of Tudor music. So it is worth having a look. Next, we have the viol, which looks very similar to a violin, and it is played with a bow. But the difference here is that it's a slightly different shape. It comes in three different sizes. Originally, you would have had a treble one, which would have been sort of like the size of a violin, a tenor, which is sort of, I suppose, been about the size of a viola, and then a bass, which would be sort of like the size of a cello. And it's played with a bow, but unlike where the violin, you put it under your chin, you don't do that with the viol. You rest it on your knee and you bring the bow backwards and forwards. Actually, it would be that hand. You bring the bow backwards and forwards and you play the frets with the other. And it doesn't matter which size. So even the smaller ones, they would rest on your knee. The sort of bigger, the bass viol, you'd put between your legs, like you do with a cello. Different shape to a violin. The back's flat, and on a violin it's curved. And it's got frets. It's like on a guitar where you put your fingers, which you don't get on a violin. On a violin, you have to know where to put your fingers. There's no frets. It's got rounded shoulders, whereas a violin sort of goes up. It's much more ornate and curvy. The viol isn't as curvy. And it's got a different number of strings. So a violin has 4 strings, but a viol can have between 5 and 7. It was used lots and lots in repertoire in sort of like the 1500s, the late 1500s. but it gradually went out of fashion and violins took over. And I suppose, in some ways, I suppose the violin may be a little bit easier to play with it under your chin. I don't know. But that's the viol. So similar to a violin, but not the same. Okay. And then we're getting to some of my favourite names. I love these names. I mean, they're just fabulous. We've got the trumpet. I think we know what a trumpet is, but back then the trumpet was quite different because it was valveless in Tudor times, which means that there's no buttons to press. And you would only be able to change the notes by your lips, by pressing your lips on the mouthpiece. It's quite difficult to play, actually. I think trumpets, generally, I have played trumpet, but a very, very long time ago. It's not the easiest instrument to play because you are reliant on changing your embouchure. There's a big word. The shape of your mouth makes it difficult. So I thought you would like to have a look at what a trumpet mouthpiece looks like, because you might not have seen these things. So this is a trumpet mouthpiece. Okay. So you blow in this hole and that part fits into your brass instrument, whether it's a trumpet or trombone or whatever. And then it's not like that. You don't blow down it in that way. You purse your lips and you basically like blow a raspberry. Bit more successful than me playing an oboe, I think. So you just put your mouth, blow raspberry. And even with the mouthpiece, you can hear that I am creating different pitches because of how tight my lips are. I won't subject you to any more of that. But that's the mouthpiece that you would have for a trumpet or a trombone. Okay. And that hasn't changed. You know, the mouthpiece is no different now to what it was really all the way back then. So let me move myself out of the way so that you can have a look at. There we go. So the pictures themselves. So that's the trumpet. All right. But the mouthpiece, and the trumpet's the picture at the bottom, the mouthpiece would also be the same for the instrument that's at the top there, which is called a sackbut. Now, there's different spellings for this. The spelling that I was always taught and the spelling that you find on YouTube for sort of people talking about Tudor music is SACKBUTT. But you can also see it spelt without the double T. It's just a single T. And the sackbut is like an early trombone. It's from the French word, and let's see if I can correctly pronounce this, that the word is saccabute, which means pull, push. And that's exactly what you're doing with a trombone. You're pushing and pulling the, the slide. That's it. You're pushing and pulling the slide. And that's what makes the different pitches. Now, it's like an early trombone, because that's exactly what you do on a trombone. It's shaped slightly different to modern trombones, but how you play it is exactly the same. And in Italy, actually, they've always called it a trombone, as that means in Italian, large trumpet. So they've always referred to it as a trombone. But you could play dynamics, and that's what was really good about these brass instruments. And you've got a much bigger range of notes on the sackbut because you've got the slide. So you could play a much bigger variety of notes. It wasn't limited like some of the other instruments. Okay, now we're nearly there. We've nearly got through all of the instruments that we're going to talk about. Recorder. Whoops, let's go back. Didn't mean to do that. The recorder. Popular in Tudor times, Henry VIII had a large collection of them. A group of recorders was called a chest because they were usually stored in a wooden chest. And they come in different sizes, just like today. You can get, they're sort of linked to the vocal range back then. They would have been soprano, alto, tenor and bass, very much like today. And the Tudor recorder, the only real difference is that it had fewer holes, but it was louder than a modern recorder. even with those fewer holes. So recorder, I don't think we really need to say a great deal about the recorder because we are still familiar with the recorder today. But what we will do is look at the lute, which is the last of the instruments we're going to look at today. And the lute is a plucked string instrument. You play it a bit like a guitar. You pluck the strings with your fingers and you move your fingers of your left hand on the fretboard. You can see the shape is different to a guitar. It's like a pear-shaped body. You've got the neck, and then the pegboard, where you tighten the strings and everything, is actually bent backwards. And the Tudor version had 5 double strings, so they would have 5 sets of 2 strings and then a single top string for the higher notes. And again, this is an instrument that originates from the Middle East, and it came over to Europe during the Crusades. Music is written in tablature or tab. Now, if you are a guitarist, you probably know what I'm talking about when I'm referring to tab, because we have guitar tab even today. So it's basically writing the music down on horizontal lines. So if I show you, there's some lute tablature. Now, I've put 2 different types of lute tablature. The first part is written down using letters. And over the top, you've got funny symbols that are representing how long each of the notes last, because that's basically the rhythm. Underneath is which strings to pluck and which position on the fretboard. So you've got A, B, C, and D there. So A would perhaps be the 1st fret, B would be the 2nd, C would be the 3rd fret, and D would be the 4th fret, so that you know which fingers, where your fingers are going to be positioned on the strings. I actually think the second one is easier to read, where you've got the numbers written down. And so you're told which string to play, so that the lines correspond to the strings, but you're actually using numbers instead of letters. But different parts of the world used a different system. So some parts of the world used the letter system, some parts of the world used the number system, and some used a combination of both, which I just think is way too complicated. Okay, so there's the lute. Now, what we're going to have a go at doing is listening to 5 pieces of music and see if you can identify which musical instruments are playing each one. So have a think about the instruments that we've looked at. So we've looked at the lute, we've looked at the virginal, the trumpet, the shawm, the sackbut, all of those different instruments that we have just had a look at. And we're going to have a listen to 5 pieces of music, and we'll see, I hope we're going to listen to 5 pieces of music, we're going to see if you can identify which musical instruments are playing each one. Okay, so I am going to fade away so that you can you know which piece you're listening to for each one, and we're going to have a little listen to our first piece. So see which instrument you think this could be. Okay, now let's have a little listen to piece number 2. And piece number 3. Piece number 4. And finally, piece number 5. Okay, so there's our 5 pieces of music. Let's see how you got on. And don't worry if you get a few things wrong, because you're finding out about these instruments. Actually, if you go on the Theatre of Music website and look under the live lessons and resources, you'll find a resource that has got all of the information about the instruments that I've been talking about. And it's got this listening activity as well. And underneath it are all of those musical files of the pieces that I've just played. And remember, here at Theatre of Music, we can't use live recordings because of copyright. So all of these have been created using computer and computer sounds. So it's much better if you have a little explore and have a listen to some of these instruments actually played by live musicians, and you can find lots of examples of lute music and virginal music and sackbut and shawms and all crumhorns. It's all out there, so you can have a listen and see these instruments being played live. So let's have a little look, shall we? So our piece number 1 was actually played on the trumpet. It was a fanfare. Trumpets, remember, could only play notes. You were using your lips to create those sounds. So they were a little bit more limited note-wise, no valves. Piece number 2 was on the shawm. And piece number 3 was the viols. Sounds a bit like a violin. Piece number 4 was the lute, bit like a guitar. And piece number 5 was the virginal, that harpsichord sound. Okay. So Another little activity, if you wanted to have a go at it, and again, it's sort of mentioned on the website for you to be able to have a look at inside the pack of stuff that we've got there. Compose a fanfare. A fanfare using just 3 simple notes, G, B, and D. And fanfares were usually played on trumpets, and they would be played for the entrance of an important person like Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, or somebody with a lot of power and importance. And you would just you would be quite limited if you're using trumpets as to what notes you could play. So you could have a go at creating your own little fanfare, maybe 8 bars long, counting 4 beats in a bar. That would be a good length of a fanfare. See if you can have a go at that. Now, it doesn't have to be played on a trumpet. I'm not expecting you to go off and play on a trumpet, but if you've got a keyboard, you could try and work it out and use a trumpet sound. Or if you haven't, but you've got maybe a recorder, you could try and playing it on your recorder just using G, B, and D. And fingers for G is your 3 fingers at the top. B is the top finger with your thumb, all with your thumb. And then D, depends on which D you use. Fingers, no pinkies. Or, if I remember rightly, it's that. No, that for top D, which is just your middle finger, no thumb. It's entirely up to you, but you could have a go at that. Okay? So, we have reached the end of today's lesson. We will be back next week and we'll be looking at some more Tudor music. And we're going to specifically be looking at how music was used in the church and the composing of things called motets and anthems. We're going to have a little listen to an anthem. And we're also perhaps going to maybe have a little go at singing something ourselves. We'll see how we do. That's going to be next week's lesson. In the meantime, and it would be a good idea to have a go at this, go and explore some Tudor music. See what you can find. Have a look and see if you can hear any of Henry VIII's stuff. And remember, he didn't write Greensleeves. You will see it all over the internet. Henry VIII, Greensleeves. He didn't write Greensleeves. They've done their research. They've changed their minds. Okay. I'm doing all of this for free at the moment. I am creating all these resources. I'm doing the lessons and everything completely for free. And I'm happy to do that. However, if you feel that you could support me and help me to make even more and create even more content, it would be wonderful if you could sort of help me with my wages, in effect, by supporting me on Coffee for £5 a month. And if you do, supporters receive a Theatre of Music magazine every quarter, and it's full of facts and quizzes and activities and all sorts of things. But you'll be helping me to create more and more content and more stuff for you. And that would be wonderful. So if you feel that you can do that and help and support me, it would be so appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next week.